the Camino changes you and why the change doesn't last. You came home different. You knew it before you even reached the airport. Something had shifted in the way you held yourself, in what felt important, in the quiet that had settled somewhere behind your eyes that hadn't been there before. You got back. You unpacked your boots. You told people it was incredible and watched their faces do the thing faces do when they're listening but not quite understanding. And then, slowly, without meaning to, you started to slip back. The emails returned. The alarm went off at the usual time. The smallness of ordinary life pressed in from every side, and the person you had been on that trail, calm, clear, certain of what mattered, began to feel like someone you had once met but could no longer quite reach. If this happened to you, you are not weak. You are not doing it wrong. You are experiencing something that neuroscience can describe with considerable precision. This is the story of what the Camino actually does to your brain, why the change is real, why it fades, and what the research says about how to stop it from disappearing entirely. Let's start with what happens on the trail itself. Dr. Kelly McGonigal at Stanford University has spent years studying the relationship between physical movement and psychological transformation. Her research and the broader body of exercise neuroscience it draws on points to something remarkable about sustained long-distance walking. After several consecutive days of walking for 6 to 8 hours, the brain begins to change in ways that go far beyond mood or fitness. Cortisol, the primary stress hormone, drops significantly, not temporarily as it does after a single workout, but structurally. The brain's threat detection system, which in ordinary life runs at a near constant low hum, begins to genuinely quiet down. The amygdala, which processes fear and urgency, becomes less reactive. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for reflection, perspective, and what psychologists call executive function, becomes more active in its place. You are, in a measurable neurological sense, becoming a calmer and clearer version of yourself. At the same time, research by Dr. Michael Merzenich at the University of California, San Francisco, one of the leading figures in neuroplasticity, has shown that sustained rhythmic physical activity accelerates the brain's capacity to form new connections. The Camino does not merely distract you from your ordinary mental patterns, it actively loosens them. The neural pathways associated with anxiety, rumination, and habitual reactive thinking become less dominant. New ones form in their place. And then there is the dopamine system. Dr. Robert Sapolsky at Stanford, whose work on stress and neurochemistry has reshaped our understanding of how the brain responds to environment, has shown that the anticipation reward cycle, the dopamine drip that ordinarily comes from checking your phone, hitting a deadline, receiving an email, is replaced on the Camino by something far more ancient and neurologically satisfying. The reward of physical progress, the pleasure of arrival, the warmth of a meal after a long day's walking. Your brain's reward system recalibrates. The small, cheap hits that ordinary life is built around begin to feel insufficient. The richer, slower rewards of physical effort and human presence feel normal. After 2 weeks on the trail, you are neurologically a different person, not metaphorically, measurably. So why does it fade? The answer is both simple and, once you understand it, surprisingly hopeful. The brain is not a fixed organ. It is a dynamic system, exquisitely responsive to environment. The changes that the Camino produces are real, but they are produced by specific conditions. Remove those conditions, and the brain, over time, reverts toward its previous baseline. Dr. Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, one of the founders of contemplative neuroscience, has spent decades studying how durable psychological transformation actually happens. His conclusion is direct. Change that is not practiced does not persist. The Camino creates the conditions for transformation. It does not, by itself, make that transformation permanent. For the changes to hold, something about the conditions that produce them must continue after the trail ends. This is not a failure of the Camino, it is simply how the brain works. The cortisol drop recurs when stress recurs. The amygdala quiets when threat is removed. Put a person back in the environment that produced their original stress patterns. The commute, the inbox, the performance, the noise, and the brain responds to those signals the way it always has. Not because the person is weak, but because the brain is doing exactly what brains are designed to do: adapt to their environment. The change fades because the environment changed back. So what does the research say about making it stick? Davidson's work points to 3 things that matter most. The first is physical movement. Not at Camino scale, that is not sustainable, but regular, sustained, rhythmic movement that gives the cortisol system somewhere to go and the prefrontal cortex something to do. The brain changes that walking produces are available to you every day. They just require you to walk. The second is reduced digital stimulation. The dopamine recalibration that happens on the Camino, the shift from cheap, fast reward cycles to slower, richer ones, begins to reverse within days of returning to a phone-centered life. The phone is not the enemy, but the relationship with it matters. Deliberate periods without it, particularly in the morning and on foot, preserve more of what the Camino built than almost anything else. The third is community. Dr. Julianne Holt-Lundstad at Brigham Young University, whose research into loneliness and health has become foundational in public health, found that the quality of social connection is among the strongest predictors of sustained psychological well-being. The connections made on the Camino, with fellow pilgrims, with the landscape, with the version of yourself that emerges on the trail, do not have to end when the walk does. Many pilgrims find that staying connected to the Camino community after they return home provides something the research would entirely predict: a continued social environment that reflects the values and pace of the trail, rather than the urgency and performance of ordinary life. WeCamino was built partly for this reason, to let the connections made on the trail continue after the boots come off. The social posts, the community, the shared experience of people still walking and people already home, keeping the thread alive between one pilgrimage and the next. Because here is what the neuroscience ultimately says: the person you are on the trail is not a temporary visitor. They are not a version of you that only exists when your feet hurt and the Wi-Fi is bad and there is no agenda beyond the next village. They are what you look like when the conditions are right. The Camino changes you because it changes your conditions. It removes the noise, the urgency, the performance, the cheap stimulation. It replaces them with movement, presence, shared vulnerability, and time. You came home different because you were different. The neurological evidence is unambiguous about that. The question is not whether the change was real. It was. The question is whether you can keep enough of the conditions alive to let that version of yourself survive the journey home. Buen camino. You already know how to walk.